point out that I got 3 of my 5 sisters here. So if I'm wrong on anything, I don't want anybody saying anything about it tonight because they think I'm infallible. No. I'm glad to be here. I came over this summer, I guess, to that party at Bush here somewhere, and got talked into this. I didn't know what I had to offer, but somebody else thought it might be worthwhile. So here I am, folks. It's, a lot of my thoughts will be disjointed, but that's the age thing, okay? It's got nothing to do with concentration. I was born in Vancouver in 1940. My dad was in the Navy, and he moved over here, and I was smart enough to come with him. And we lived on Vancouver Street at one time, and of course he liked to make the odd bet, and when I was young, maybe 3 or 4 years old, he'd get home from work, and we'd go over the old Willows racetrack and sit on the fence. He would sit me up on the fence, and he'd make a bet, I guess, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I went to Bank Street School. I don't know if that still exists or not.
Yes.
Yeah. It does exist? Wow, because it was old then. And I guess with the Department of Veterans Affairs in those days, the DVA put out mortgages for veterans and armed forces personnel. And using that, we moved to the big old farmhouse right at the foot of the Church Hill on West Saanich Road. I was in grade 1 at the time, and had to go to a new school. And of course the other school was also new to me. I think I was a pretty well protected kid because I was perfect. And so I'm this new kid in school, and I think Jack Mather still remembers it. I don't know why, but here's the city kid come to the country, and it was the country in those days. So I got along there, and I don't know if it was that year or the next year, it was the cutest little girl I had ever seen. Arrived in school. She was kind of a girly girl. The others were cute. Bonnie Footner was, of course, but she was different. And of course, that was Marilyn Cudmore. And met her again tonight. She hasn't changed.
I thought I was an Eskimo because I came from Saskatchewan.
The school in those days, of course, was what I called the annex, which I guess is the original school. And then there was a double building with the 2 classrooms in it. We had split classes. And I remember that I was always more interested in what the class ahead of me was doing than what I was doing, and I didn't do much of my own work, but I had fun doing the one ahead of me. Didn't do me any good, but there we are. And the rest of it's kind of a blur. Had lots of fun until I got to about grade 6. And at that point, they moved us over into the annex, into the basement classroom. We thought we were pretty good living in there. Mr. Wilway was the president. He had one arm, leather hand, and of course he was the principal, so the office was in the other building, so he had to spend a lot of time over there. Well, there was the one door in the front. Of course, you had to have the 2 exits, so they put a door in the side, and the cement foundation, I remember, was sort of 2 or 3 feet up, and then the door out the side. And of course, the school, or the building, was between there and the office. So he couldn't see us all going out that side door, and we were supposed to be sitting there doing our work. The other thing I remember about that is that the back of that classroom was an oil burner to heat the building. And of course, he would disappear off to the office at lunchtime. Of course, we're in grade 6, we can be trusted. Well, we turned that oil burner up so far we could actually toast our sandwiches on it. Why we didn't burn the place down, of course, oiled floors in those days and everything, no linoleum, it was all just old floors, but obviously it didn't burn down, I guess because we were so smart. The sports field was up behind that, about the length of a soccer field, and it had a huge giant fence on the one side of it with the wire on there, and of course it was a great sport to kick the soccer ball over, and then we had to make the round trip to Coquetchit. The school area at that time was the the municipal hall, I don't know if it's still there or not. The police department was in the police department was in the bottom. Of course, I knew most of them friendly, not that they were after me till later. Then there was the Women's Institute Hall next to that, and that place I hated, because that's where they had the dance classes. And my mother thought that I should learn to dance, and I should learn to square dance and everything else. And I thought it much more important that I learned to throw a curve playing baseball. So I managed to put up with that. And then there was the store next door to it. My sister tells me it was Stinson's store. It had apartments above that, I think, and there was a house right behind it on a lot. And a guy by the name of Don Ward, who would have been 2 or 3 years older than me, and his sister, and I don't remember her name, I don't remember my own name half the time, but they lived there, and eventually he had the paper route, the morning paper route, and eventually I got that when he outgrew it. Now, in those days, Mount Newton, of course, was the ogre that all the little kids were threatened with, that that's where we were going to have to go. We were going to take a bus and meet all those rough kids from up that area and everything else. And the first year they opened the Royal Oak Junior Senior High School, and I recall the elementary school right beside it. So I didn't have to go to Mount Newton. It was a kind of an L-shaped building. It had a real nice gym, and on the top they had the shop with Mr. Bennell. And I never knew him at all, but he got the biggest cheer of any teacher when they opened the school. And later I could see why. He was just a great guy. He didn't act like a teacher at all. There was the home ec class up there too. I remember a teacher there, Miss Horrell, I think her name was. And I ran into her later. I was working in the shipyards. Her husband worked with me, and I thought, that's odd. There's a teacher sort of in my same age group. And the other one was the typing class. And the star of the class here, of course, is Mr. Sheldrake, because he's got a pin, the Order of Canada, that he can wear for his typing skills. And of all my years in school, that's the one thing I regret that I never paid attention in, was the typing class, because of course now it's all typing.
Still do it the same old way.
Yeah, my one finger's got calluses on it. There was a nice gym in that school, which was a change, and of course the gym instructor was Larry Booth, who played for the Shamrocks, and of course I've been a lacrosse fan, played lacrosse myself, and he was a bit of a hero until I met him. And he was a tough guy, there's no question about that. And the thing that sticks in my mind about him, that we were down in, I can't remember what kind of a class it was, but it was grade 9 or 10, I guess. And Harvey Sherman, I guess, who is not here tonight, it's a good thing, because I owe him a pop right in the nose, was throwing spitballs at him from the back towards the front, and Larry Booth walked in, and of course I'm Mr. Innocent sitting there, and all of a sudden the briefcase whapped me in the ribs and said, "Get up to the principal's office." And I said, okay. So it came the strap, and he started on me, and of course I'd been working, so he didn't hurt much. He tried, and eventually he was started from back over here somewhere and coming right over the top. And next hand, I just kept sticking him out as long as he wanted to swing. And he was getting madder and madder, and I was sort of giggling. And finally, the principal, Mr. Clark, stepped in and said, "I think that's enough." And that was my recollection from the high school. It's one that kind of sticks with you. And of course, when we first moved out to West Saanich and Markham Road there, the Markham Road, I went down it today with Heather, and it's like Grand Central Station. I couldn't believe it. It was almost a trail down the road, and it was almost covered with hawthorn trees. Is that the right term? Mm-hmm. And it was like a tunnel down there, and of course that was the great beyond to a kid, 6 years old, who didn't know what was down there, except the kids from the end walked out every morning with a little trailer, and they had milk cans on it, and they would leave it on the corner of Markham Road, and the West Saanich freight truck would pick it up and deliver it to the dairy, I guess, and then leave empty ones, and they'd pick them up when they went home at night. A couple of deer occasionally would walk down Markham Road, and that was worth comment in those days. Now they're just, I guess, overrun with deer, but it was a pretty big deal in those days because you could shoot them. And across the road, fronting West Saanich, across Markham and fronting West Saanich, there was a great big old barn, and it was one of those spooky places that 6-year-old kids didn't want, 7-year-old kids didn't want to go to. I don't know who owned it. I don't know when it came down, but it just sort of vanished in my memory. Somebody probably knows who owned it here, but I see.
I just asked Arnold, and it was Dick DeVerne.
Okay. And on our property, out behind the house, was a great big old barn. And of course, when you're 6 years old, everything's great and big. But it had big sliding doors in the front and one door that opened. It had a big hayloft in it with the arm out over it with a pulley system where the fork would drop down and pick up loose hay with its tongs, lift it up, pull it back, and you'd trip it in. Bales weren't common in those days. It was a great place to play, and early on, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old, Mother sent me out to the barn when, I don't know why to this day, but I thought I was a pretty tough guy, so I opened the door, screamed and slammed the door and ran for my mother. And of course it was a whole bunch of horses standing there looking me in the face. We didn't own any horses, which kind of scary. Next door to us to the east side, I guess, was the Hawks family, Ted Hawks and Florence Hawks, I think. He owned Hawks Realty in Vancouver, and he was quite a horseman. He had some pretty quality horses. He had a jumper named Gamelin, and this horse was at least the best in British Columbia, and I think further than that. I sort of in the back of my mind, I remember the Toronto Horse Show, which is as good as you get in the show horse thing. But he also had a little pony that had lived in the circus, and this pony could get out of anywhere. He could open gates, he could untie knots. He was just Houdini with the horse world, and obviously was the leader of the herd. And come on, pals, let's go for a walk. I'll open the gate and let's go to MacDonald's and scare the crap out of that little kid. So Mother, of course, didn't believe it. You know, it was horses in the barn, so she didn't believe it. But anyway, she phoned Hawks, and Ted came and got them. And I used to sit and watch them across the field, make sure they were still there. And of course, in those days, we walked or biked to school, which you could do. But I don't know if you can do that now. But on the way home, of course, Colquitt's Creek ran under the road, and that was water and kids. It was a great source of entertainment on the way home. And just east of the creek on the north side of West Saanich, there was an old horse trough, cement horse trough. And for the early days, I guess, I don't remember, I think, Grant, you probably know it worked. I don't know how they filled it or anything else. But
Maybe by gravity from the creek, I think.
Is that what it was?
I think.
But I know it did work. And the odd kid got dunked in there on the way home. And of course, Ken Kiernan, who was the agriculture minister later on in Bennett's government, lived in the house there with his family. And on the way home, walking towards home from the school, there was a few people that I remember. There was Mrs. Mellish, was the piano teacher. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking Heather Bell Kennels, is that right? Okay, God, I'm good. And she raised mastiffs, and I still can't play the piano because I'm sitting there petrified looking at this big mastiff over my shoulder. I could find middle C, and that was it, folks. I didn't really want to be near that dog. And there was Mrs. Hobbs, who lived up on the corner by Wilkinson Road, who was a nice little old English lady. I remember she was kind of an artist. Lady over here shaking her head, God, I don't know why I'm up here. She should be. And we would cut her, you know, she would pay the kids to cut her lawn and that that sort of thing. She was kind of an elderly woman. And going down the store, of course, on the corner of Wilkinson and West Saanich, and I can't remember the couple that owned that.
Blue Orchard.
Orchards, that's what it was. Sisters know everything. That was my first job. I got a job in there stacking the shelves and carrying stuff out, and delivering stuff for people close. And of course, there's no credit cards in those days, and they would extend credit. And people would come in, and I guess payday, they would come in and pay their bill, and things worked well. Down at the foot of that hill on the west side of Colquitt's Creek, on the north side of the street road, was a guy, and I think maybe Mr. Cuddell, or something very close to that. And the only reason I remember this guy is that he wanted us to help pick fruit, and he had currants, which had got to be the fiddliest, stupidest thing you've ever tried to pick in your life. I mean, there's an expression that I won't use here. And there was, carrying on the Zazulas, Pete was the bodybuilder. He was a big, strong kid. And his sister was Sonia. She would be a year, I think, older than I was. And then the corner of Cheeseman, there was Wendy Williams on the corner. She was a year or two older than me, and the brother Wayne. I always remember her. She was a runner. God, could she run. She just, not the stand-up straight thing they do now, but she was fast. High school, so she was quite a star. And of course, Goyette's lived up at the top. Now also on that walk home, which got pretty entertaining sometimes, one of the activities that kids, never me of course, would carry on was throwing stones, often at each other from a distance, and usually at the glass insulators on the telephone pole. So if your telephone went out, the guy at the end here obviously knows that. And there was a guy, Walt Mycock was one of the Saanich police officers. I knew his son Dave, and a couple of years younger than him, and I can't remember this kid's name. Sorry? Walter Mycock. But, there was Dave was my pal, and then a couple of years younger than him was his Dennis, was it?
He was pound cake first, then he went to the policeman.
He was classic. He could pick those insulators off just one after the other. He was good. And the funny thing is, later on in life, I'm coaching my son in Little League Baseball, and I'd get kids 10, 11 years old, and they would be throwing the ball like this, and they had no idea. So I tried to throw them, and finally one day in exasperation, I said, "Haven't you guys ever thrown a rock?" Well, you'd think I was a devil risen up. And they all looked at me and said, "What?" So I talked to them, and their mothers would have killed them if they'd thrown rocks. Most of them couldn't even throw a rock into the water at the ocean. I mean, that's how bad it was. It was just bizarre. The Colquitt's Creek, of course, right on the south side of the road, there was a nice little pond there. And there was a tree that I remember is probably a maple tree, and it had on the west side of the bank, and it had a big outgrowth, probably a big large burl hanging out, and it made a beautiful little pond for the fish to hide in underneath. So we'd lie down on there, and great fishermen hunters would drop our worms in front of these fish, and you'd catch the odd one in there. And I remember doing that one day, and it was a weekend, I think. His dad was home, and all of a sudden, my rod, my gear, and everything, there was a splash in this thing, and off it went down the creek, just going like hell. So I chased it, and got my rod back, lost the gear, lost the fish and everything else, and the only thing I can think to this day, it was a steelhead. And how it got up in there, I don't think we ever saw a steelhead in there before or again. But I can say I caught it, but not for long, but I caught it. It was a great place to grow up in Royal Oak. There was lots of bush, there was lots of fields to play in, you could roam and do whatever you wanted pretty much. The only downside, of course, there was no sports organizations like baseball or lacrosse or anything. Later, I played basketball in Cordova Bay, and then I played out at Brentwood when I was about 16, I guess. And in those times, you would take a trip to Souk for the evening, which was a drive because there's no highways like there is now, and occasionally up to Port Alberni, which Alberni had, I believe, the senior men's basketball championship team in Canada, the Alberni Athletics. And we would, excuse me, we would play as before they played, so we'd sit and watch Elmer Speidel and all those guys. And of course, the radio guy that called their games in those days is Jim Robson, of course, the old voice of the Canucks. And every once in a while, I see him and I say Elmer Speidel, and he kind of thinks, God, we're getting old. The bush, of course, right across from our house was the Scout Hall. Sadler, what did we say his name was? Bob Sadler? Slater, it's Bob Slater. Was a fireman. He was a scoutmaster in there for years. But you could carry on straight through the bush and up through, was owned by the Singh family that had the dairy farm at the top of the church hill. That was a lot of their property, and you could carry right on through, right up to come out on Beaver Lake Road, right by Sheldrakes. The Singh family, there was two older boys. There was Billy and Kella, and there was two girls, Prado and Banty, if I remember right. Isn't that right, Bonnie?
Yes.
Okay. And Bishan, of course, he was my age and a good friend, and we did a lot together. And I was talking to Heather, and she said the obituary showed that he died October 1st of this year. So I guess we're getting there. They had a big dairy farm, and I think Bishan lived in Duncan. He had a herd of quality cows. I was at the PNE one year, and I asked him, he wasn't around, so I missed him there. We could also go up above what is now, I think, Royal Oak Avenue up in Broadmead, I'm sorry. And of course, that was wild country dust, because you just didn't get up there very often. Get up there on a weekend, it was lots of fun. Colquitt's Creek was a never-ending source of entertainment with, of course, kids and water. That's the way it was. And every year, it would overflow and form Quick's Pond. And it would, in a good year, it would actually run through into our place, in the corner of our bottom field would be wet, and Hawk's place behind or beside us would be wet halfway up. We would hunt ducks there occasionally, and till one year, Quicks decided that there was some money to be made, so they leased out the hunting rights to a shooting club out of Victoria, which didn't make us very happy because we used to go on there and shoot from there too, but now it was private, so we couldn't do that. It annoyed us, so we would go sit down in the corner of our field, and the ducks would come in probably from Sheldrakes or Beaver Lake and come down the valley, and we got first crack at them. We weren't very popular when we were doing that, but that's one of the things they had to live with. But the best part about Quick's Pond, or Quick's Bottom, I think they call it now, each year it would freeze. It was cold in there in those days. There was snow. My sister's birthday, actually it still is, I guess, on the 14th of March. And we often had ice skating, tobogganing parties for her birthday. And of course, the pond would freeze over, and we'd skate for hours on end on it. We'd be absolutely frozen, couldn't feel our feet, our hands weren't a whole lot better. And if it snowed, we'd plow or, scrape a hockey rink out or whatever it was. We couldn't skate where the dam, but some of them could. And when it got chewed up, there's how do you flood it? So we'd pump a bunch of hole in the ice and jump on it, and the water would come up, and we'd spread it around, and it would freeze overnight. And of course, you're out there on a weekend, and things are getting pretty thirsty, pretty hungry, and you might bring a sandwich down, but you never remember to bring any water, so you'd drink from the pond. Now, I know one young guy, and I think there's probably others, got the best dose of worms you ever saw. they were so damned itchy, I almost drove my dad nuts when he was driving me to the hospital. It was just something I never really want to go through again. I mentioned Sheldricks there. Grant was 2 years older than me, I think. And of course his dad was an engineer on the boats in the Navy Yard that my dad was the captain on. And so they were good friends. Fireboat was a pretty good deal. I would go to work with Dad occasionally and fish off the dock for perch, and it was just a great way to spend the day. Grant, I remember you had cougar hounds at one point. Don't know if you ever caught a cougar.
Never saw one.
No, okay. Dogs kept scaring them away. But having said that, my brother took the paper route from me after I had it. And as you came along Beaver Lake Road, there was just a little hill down to the, what was it, the interurban right away there?
VNS.
VNS, okay. And there was a little rock bluff on this thing. And Neil came home one morning, he could hardly talk. There'd been a big cat sitting up on there. And, it's the only one I think we ever saw, or he ever saw. I never saw it. Now, when I was younger, they sent me to the YMCA to learn to swim. And Archie McKinnon, of course, was Mr. YMCA in those days. And his method of teaching is throw you in the deep end. If you made it, you could swim, and if you didn't, fine. But he refined, you know, you could all get out, and he refined that. He was kind of a heroic figure, I guess, in Victoria. He taught thousands of kids to swim. In small world, once I was in the Vancouver Police, my boss was married to his daughter, Heather. Ryan, so he moved back to Victoria when Tom retired. The best part about the lake, my mother had a bee in her bonnet, amongst others, that you couldn't go swimming outside until the 24th of May weekend, whether it be the 23rd or whatever it fell on in those days. And of course, you know how much parents know when you're that old. So I would go up there and going fishing, and you'd fish for bass off the rocks out the back of the lake, I'm sure everybody knows. And of course, I would fall in regularly. I remember coming home one day and my hair, I guess, was soaking wet. It was late for dinner, so I rushed it, came home, and they said, how come your hair's wet? I said, oh, I fell in. Why aren't your clothes wet? Whoops. The back of that lake wasn't very well policed in those days, and on the Friday, Saturday, and the odd Sunday night, you would find pretty raunchy parties up in the back, lots of beer and drinking and carousing. And for some reason, the police never went up there. You didn't go, Bonnie? Okay. I didn't think so. They were a lot older than us. But on the next morning, for the enterprising young fellows that got up at dawn and hustled up there, I think probably I beat Sheldrick once in a while, he often beat me, was the beer bottles that were left over. 2 cents a piece, that was pretty good money in those days, and plus whatever else they'd left up there. I remember finding army guys' hats and all kinds of stuff, junk. But that was one of the highlights. Speaking about parents not knowing very much, later in life I found the Demon Rum and quite enjoyed it, and I would be out, still living at home, I'd be out at night when I shouldn't have been drinking, and I would stumble in about 1 or 2 o'clock, and our house was an old farmhouse. You came up the back stairs, you turned left and went in, it was a pantry, or I guess it was a pantry you'd call a mudroom. Then you would turn right to go into the kitchen, and you would walk right into the old sawdust burner stove. And to get to my bedroom upstairs, I had to walk around the stove, on the other side of it, into the dining room, up the stairs to bed. Well, my father wasn't a fool, I guess. And when he thought I was out and maybe shouldn't be, and figured I'd probably overdone it, he would leave the oven door down. Of course, I would come stumbling in, Bigfoot. I thought I was tippy-toeing, and all of a sudden, crash, I'd go over this bloody oven door. And that was it. I knew I was getting up at 6:30 the next morning, whether I liked it or not. The Beaver Lake, when I got older, of course, would jump in the water on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon and swim around the lake and across Elk Lake. Bathers and that from the other end of town would be over at Happy Land on the north end of the lake. So you'd swim over there and talk to your friends and maybe have a hot dog or something and swim back. It was just a great way to spend an afternoon. And of course, the concession stand at Beaver Lake was run by Wilf Sadler and his family, and I always remember was there pinball machines in there, and of course it was highly illegal, but they would actually pay if you won games. And I seem to remember a nickel. Bonnie, you're giggling, is that?
Well, I was never allowed to go in that.
No, of course my dad was a captain on these ships, and Fred was one of the engineers. George Sand was here. His brother Cliff was a chief engineer for my dad for quite a number of his trips. And of course, so he's away at sea, and got a great big vegetable garden out in the back to look after, and animals. And of course, I had to look after the vegetable garden with help from some of the younger ones, and I hate gardening to this day. And our first cow we got was a nice, gentle Jersey cow. She was a sweetheart, and I learned to milk her and did well. And I don't know what happened to her, but she was replaced by a Jersey Guernsey, and she was huge. She turned out to be the cow from hell. I hated her, just hated her. She had a mind of her own. There wasn't a fence built she couldn't go through. And of course, we all know the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. Well, she thought it would be greener maybe a mile up the road as well. Or I recovered her on Interurban Road. I recovered her on Beaver Lake Road, and lots of places closer than that. And of course, once you find her, she'd look at you like, oh, okay. So you'd put a rope on her and try and lead her home. Well, she'd come on her own conditions. Well, maybe I'll stop and eat this, and I'm tugging, and she wasn't nasty out there, but she just had a mind of her own. And it got to the point where I would be late for school often enough. The teacher would look at me and say, "Cow?" I'd say, "Yes." "Sit down." I thought, well, I can fix this. And of course, I don't know how many of you know, but the way to dry a cow up from her milk is to not milk her dry. So I thought, well, let's do that. So I would get 2/3 of what she would normally give. I'd leave that in her and put a little water in the milk, so Mom and Dad thought we were getting the same amount of milk. And I got caught at that too. I got caught at a lot of things. She was in her own field. Actually, Dad and I we put up a brand new barbed wire fence on Markham Road. And she was out in the field one day. She took a look at us, stuck her head through, went like that, walked through the fence, and that was it. You just couldn't keep her in. But when she wanted to stay in the field and I wanted her to milk, I'd have to call her. She'd look at you with just a great disdain and wouldn't come. So finally I had to get a tobacco can. I'd go get an inch or two of feed in this tobacco can, and I'd, "Come on, bossy, come on. And of course she'd take a step and I'd take 2 steps, and she'd take soon. Pretty soon we're running and she's catching me. I'd dump it and she would stop and eat that, knowing that I'm going to go back to get another can, and we'd do this about 3 times, and then she'd get in the stall and milk her, and she was fine. I don't know what happened to her, but I don't think she's up there. Now, about that same time, Quicks, of course, who owned Quicks Farm, the mother lived in the big house up on the hill. There was 2 brothers, Buster, who ran the dairy farm, and his brother Fred, who was, I think, in construction at that time. And I knew them, and of course, male calf is no good to going to be no good to them at all. So Buster would often give me a male calf when it's born. Now, how do you get it home? So many's the time I would throw the calf up over my shoulders, hold its feet and front legs, and I got crapped on a few times, but I'd walk up Wilkinson Road, down and home, and I would raise them for veal and occasionally a little bit longer. They had to feed them, of course. You put your hand in a bucket of formula and they suck, and pretty soon they learn to drink by themselves. Made a few dollars at it, didn't get rich. As I said, there was Buster who ran the farm. He had equipment for the farm. He had a tractor, and we had at that time a baler, which wasn't very common in those days. And a guy named Roy Jewell, who lived next to Sheldrake's, was a heavy-duty mechanic at Heaney's, and I guess he cut some kind of a deal where he'd maintain Buster's equipment for him. And in exchange, he would get to use it, and he would run around and cut hay in places like ours. It'd be 4 acres or 5 acres or whatever it was, and then he'd bale it, and he went all over the neighborhood cutting and custom baling. He worked at Haney's on the afternoon shift and was haying during the day. And I became friendly with him and spent a lot of time throwing bales around with him, both his, into his place. Now, Roy was also the local blacksmith farrier for the whole neighborhood. He's very, very good at it. He was not tall, but he used to gallop horses, very, very strong. But he had race horses, which kind of intrigued me a little bit. And I would go out with him in the spring. I spent a lot of time around his farm, and I would go out in the spring to Sandown in the morning where they were training the horses to run in Vancouver. I guess I was about 15 at that time, and once the horses were ready, we would get on the ferry and take them to Vancouver. One of the guys that was a friend of his, and they all were all racetrack kids when they were young, the Willows and that sort of thing, was a guy named Jerry Milburn. I don't know if any of you know him. He was a teacher at North Saanich. And he was a horseman as well as doing his school teaching. And he took a little kid out there named, he wasn't very big, Inky Anderson. Dennis Anderson is actually his name, but we knew him at the racetrack as Inky, because he always had, I don't know what his pens did, but they always had ink on his hand. I still see him in San Francisco when I go down there at the racetrack, and I call him Inky, and everybody looks at me and he just shakes his head. Nobody should remember that far back, I guess. So my aunt used to come over this. They come to the races came to Sandown in those days, and my aunt and her husband owned horses, and they took me out with them one afternoon. This is before I went to with Roy. So I looked at the horses, I looked at the racing form, I was absolutely confused, but there was a horse named Wheatlander there, and I thought, he looks like he's pretty good. So I bet my only $2 on this horse to place, because I didn't have enough guts to bet him to win. He won. He paid $10 or $12 to place, and that's been my downfall, folks. I was hooked. Now that made up for the time we took Jerry's mare over there, True Justice she was called, a great big chestnut mare. First opening day, raining like it, mud was like that deep at the track. There's Jerry and his dad and Art Knowles and myself and a couple others, and over we went. And of course we watched this nice mare win, paid $92, and between of us we never had 10 cents on her. The tears were real. But sometime later I got even with that. Art Knowles and I was actually working at I served an apprenticeship in the dockyard as a shipwright, and I wasn't very good at it. But there was no work here at all, and so I went to Vancouver looking for work, and there wasn't a whole lot of work there either. But anytime I was out of work and needed money, I could go to the racetrack and get a groom's job just like that. I was pretty good at it. And I would watch races every day, and I'd pick out horses that maybe ran into a little bit of trouble in a race, and I thought might have a chance to win next time. And one night I was standing there with Art Knowles, who was a butcher from Victoria, and a horse called Flea S, and Inky Anderson was on it. He rode this thing up to the gate at a gallop, took it back. Second time I looked at Art, is you watching this? He said, yeah. And they were just about to go into the gate, so we ran for the windows. And all in those days, you get the $2 win, place, or show. You couldn't get them all like today. I ended up at the $2 win window, and I said, start punching tickets. I'd had a pretty good day. The bell rang, and it stopped. I don't know how many I had, but the horse paid $55. I had money sticking out of my pockets, out of my ears. I was a big shot that night. I liked the people at the racetrack. When I was 16, I stayed over there for a couple of weeks and lived in a tack room on the back and thoroughly enjoyed myself. And it had a lot to do with later in life. At the top of the church hill, of course, was the church, the Anglican church up there, I think. And we never did, Halloween we'd try and get into trouble without destroying or hurting anybody. So it came to mind one week, that I thought maybe nobody had ever rung the church bells. So Halloween night, I snuck up there, and all of a sudden the church bells are ringing all out across the valley, and then there's some little guy screaming down the hill as fast as he could run, scared stiff. I gather it was done after that, but it was a good thing at the time. But across the road, like next door was the Sings Dairy Farm, and across the road was a little yellow house, if I remember right. And the local veterinarian lived there. His name was Doc Lehman, Lehman, I think. He had a son, and I can't remember my own name, but I can't remember his. But he was the guy you called when your cow had problems or whatever else. And I guess he was a pretty good little country vet. But almost right behind him, there was a larger farm. It was almost hidden from the road by bushes. And a guy named Archie Brown owned that. Now, he had cows in there, but he also had racehorses, which were where Roy Jewell and I would show up. And he had a farmhand with him. The guy was obviously mentally challenged, is the term they use these days. He was from, I found out later, the Wilkinson Road mental home at that point. Archie had him out on kind of a lend-lease basis and paid him, stayed at the farm and worked for Archie. He was always smiling. He was either busy rolling a cigarette or he was smoking a cigarette. Or never saw him do anything else. And he'd sit there and we'd have a conversation and he'd look at you, he didn't understand much. But the story I heard later was that for some reason he had to go back to Wilkinson Road, and he was perfectly happy living with Archie. He was harmless, but for some reason he had to go back to Wilkinson, back to the institution, which upset him. And he got a rifle, I understand, out of a piggery on the farm or somewhere, and decided he wasn't going back. So he got down and started shooting, and of course the Saanich police arrived and were looking for him. One of the officers was sneaking through the bush, I guess, and came up on Ramey. His name was Ramey, and he was in sort of a deadfall log area looking out over the valley. And instead of doing something, that policeman went for help, and while he was gone for help, Ramey shot and killed one of the Saanich police officers, a guy by the name of Kirby, who lived up at the corner of Beaver Lake Road, right across from the store. So that was one of the bad days. Also in that area, racehorses again, was a guy named Art Masters. He had a nice mare called Milady Pleases. It was a pretty good horse area. As I said earlier, I served an apprenticeship and went to Victoria or Vancouver. I served for work. And when I was out of work, I'd go to the track and make money there. And that's about all I've got, folks. As I say, it's not a lot of Royal Oak, but as I said to Ann earlier, Christ, I left here half a century ago. Sounds a lot worse than 50 years, doesn't it? 1964, I was working at the track in Vancouver, and I was filling in applications anywhere I could think of to get a steady job. And one of those applications was for the Vancouver Police Department. And of course, you're filling out dozens of these things, and I got a phone call, and they said, "Would you come and write the exam?" Which I did, in shock. I finished in the top 2 or 3 out of 100, I guess. So I was interviewed. They did a background check, obviously not a very good one because they hired me. And on the 28th September '64, I started joining the Vancouver Police, and I didn't know it at the time, but that was the start of an absolutely interesting, entertaining 30 and a half years. Thoroughly enjoyed it, had more fun than anybody should be allowed to have. And of course, now I had to tell the lady that I was working for at the track that I was leaving. So I gave her a couple of weeks' notice, and I was more concerned about the horses than her. So she said, "Well, would more money help?" And I said, No. She said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm joining the police department." Well, she went absolutely white. And I couldn't figure that out, but we found her another person to do the job. And of course, later on, I found out that she was a woman involved in women's health issues before Dr. Morgenthaler. So she was a nice lady, but that's what she did, apparently. The police training was tough. They had you running miles, and of course I could run the length of the lacrosse floor or basketball court, and that was it. But the rest of it was common sense. I didn't know anything about the police. For example, in Victoria, Saanich, they use names. Vancouver, bigger force, they use numbers. So I got tagged with 356 and carried that for years. My first night out on the job was a midnight shift. And of course I'm assigned to a more senior guy who's going to teach me what I should know. So you walk into the parade room that night in your brand new uniform, and it was just like going back to school again. "Jack, you're the new kid in this group of guys." And they're all kind of looking at you. "Can we trust you to, look after us or our backs or anything else?" So, and that happened for a while. But the first night, I'd been out for about an hour, and I was in East Vancouver. I didn't know the geography, I didn't know the streets. I knew Hastings Street because that went to the racetrack. And that was about the extent of it. So I'm watching the street signs and trying to listen to the radio and watch for bad guys and all kinds of things. And then they broadcast that there was a car chase coming out Venables Street from the skid road, and we weren't far away, so we pulled up to the corner of Venables and Clark, and shooting right across the front of us was a brown 54 Ford, never forget it, going like stink. Of course, my partner was pretty eager, so he dropped the clutch on the Chev we had and started. I said, "There's a police car behind him," and he stopped quick, and by went the police, 2 or 3 police cars. We'd all been in the middle of the intersection if I hadn't said anything. He thanked me for it later, instead of telling me to shut up like they did with most kids. That same night, there was the same chase. The dog man was in the West End, and he had the beat man from Robson Street riding around in the car for a little bit of company. I guess his dog was getting on his nerves. He wouldn't stop and let the beat man out. They ended up hitting a farmer's truck, or a farmer's truck hit them at First and Clark. He's lying there in the middle of the road, blood coming out both ears, and the dog wouldn't let anybody near him. So they got another dog master in, and they got him out. Well, the kid had dumped the car, and he ended up down on the CN Flats, the Falls Creek Flats. And we hunted for him. God, we were there 2 hours. We got right through to Main Street looking for this kid. And we were walking back, and Chuck said, "Carry on, I gotta have a whiz here." So he stood quietly in the corner, and I walked through the yard, and he was watching, and here's this kid stuck his head out behind a door watching me walk by. Well, the next thing he knew, there was a hand on him. He was in cuffs, and the next thing I knew, a couple of stars in the department arrived and scooped him, and away he went. Well, that was our arrest, so my partner was pretty upset because I didn't know enough. So down we go to the police station, and up in the detective office, they had little 6, 8 by 8 interview rooms with a glass front on them. So in we went, and the sergeant said, "Oh, young fella, first night in the job?" "Yes, sir." And he said, "Well, he's in there," he says, "guard him and make sure nothing happens to him." How tough can this be? So there's the usual carrying on around it, and all of a sudden 2 guys that were enormous. One was a Frenchman, Armand Hammond was his name, and Ray Grant, who I later worked with, who was a logger who would sooner fight than do anything else. Huge guys. They walked in plain clothes, little pork pie hat, this guy in the French accent, he says, "What does that little bastard?" he says. I didn't know if he was a chief or who he was. And I said, "Right in here, sir." So he opened the door, and of course I'm in charge of this guy's health and welfare. The 2 of them walked in, filled the room, and I'm kind of watching this, and he pulls a switchblade out of his knife, out of his pocket, and goes, click, and held it up to this kid, and he said, "If that policeman dies," he says, "you will too." And I'm like, God, there goes, that was a nice career. But they walked out, and I got home that next morning, and I thought, God, I don't know if I can put up with this for 25 years, but things did settle down. And it became a lot of fun. Then they had me walking beats from Hastings to Renfrew and then Commercial Drive, and of course, middle of the night, pouring down rain. It just wasn't a lot of fun. And no radios in those days. You had to use the call boxes that would ring in every hour, and if you arrested somebody, you had to drag him to a call box to get the wagon there. It wasn't a lot of fun. And the other thing in the academy, of course, they were, obviously integrity was there, we wouldn't have been hired, but they warned you about the downfalls in policing. And of course, I found out over the 30 years, it's like living in a barrel of whiskey. Drink booze everywhere you want it and don't want it. Women, you had to be careful with, excuse me, they'd get you nothing but trouble. And then the other thing they bugged you about was, of course, all the sudden deaths you would have to go to. And it was more of a, almost a hazing thing to just sort of make you very apprehensive about these things. So they didn't mention rock and roll, so I figured that was all right. So I'm working the Hastings, way out Hastings one night, and a guy came down from Oak Ridge and put into a car. They were short of guys, and they picked me up. And I didn't know where I was, still in those days, and we pulled into the darkest alley I think I'd ever seen, and I could see up on the right side of the car there was about a 4-story house. He said, "I'll be back." Took the keys and disappeared. So I saw the basement door open, and there's a red light in behind it. Oh, okay, this is what they tell us about. 5 minutes later he's back, just "Come on in." Okay. So in I go, and it was a recreation room. It was, a guy had a nice bar set up, red lights, mood lights, etc., etc. And here sitting on the bar stool was a gorgeous woman. Not very, she wasn't overly clothed, let's put it that way. Skirt up to here, sitting on a bar stool with a cigarette and a drink in front of her. So, "You want a drink?" I said, "Well, why not?" So I'm sitting there wondering what the hell's going on here, and there's a knock on the door, and I thought, "Oh," and I put my drink down on the floor beside me, and I said, "Oh, don't worry, it's probably just the inspector." Okay. Well, it turned out this was an ex-policeman's house. He owned a cartage company at the time, and that's the way he liked his wife to dress. But it was knock your eyes off with a stick. Of course, as I mentioned, the sudden death that you get sort of hazed about, and you're kind of apprehensive about dead bodies. I'd seen a couple, I think one at Beaver Lake and one somewhere else, but you're kind of looking, and so sure enough, on a Saturday afternoon we get a call, and I'm working with a different partner this time. He's a little 5'9", I guess, probably a Sicilian guy named Ray Corse, and he would wear the hat up on the back of his head. He's a cocky little bugger. And he worked in the skids, and that's where I was working with him that afternoon, and we got a call as a sudden death in the Empress Hotel. And that's not the Victoria Empress, believe me. The rooms are probably 8 or 9 or 10 feet wide, not much longer. There's single room occupancy things you read about in the Vancouver papers. And we found him dead. The maid found him. So up we go, and Ray walked in, and I'm kind of giving it this, what are we going to find here? And the old guy had died you came in the door, immediately to your right was a dresser. There was a little walkway in front of that, probably the width of a man's shoulders, the bed, and on the other side of the bed was again a little walkway. And of course, we'd called for the people to take the body away, and you always had to search the room to make sure that, you know, there was nothing of value that you would pick up and seize and give to the next of kin. Well, this old guy had died in the between the dresser and the bed. Flat in his back, just went to sleep, I guess. And Ray kind of looked at me and he said, "You search the other side of the room and the bed." He says, "I'll look after this." So he got down 1 foot on either side of the guy, the body in between his legs, and he went through the dressers. And as he got lower and lower, he got down, he's almost squatting on this guy. And he says, "Oh, look at this." He says, "The old guy didn't die broke anyway." And he pulled a nice Rolex box out of the bottom drawer. He's still squatting over this guy. He opened it up. Well, it wasn't a Rolex, it was 2 coil spring snakes. Literally, he came straight up off this body. He landed on the bed, and I thought he was going out the window. And when I'd finished laughing, and of course that was great because I wasn't worried about a body anytime after that, he turned to me and he says, "If you tell anybody, I'll kill you." Would have ruined his reputation. I think he just might have shot me too. Years and years and years of those kinds of things. I ended up walking the Skid Row beat on Hastings Street. It was the center of activity in Vancouver and British Columbia. Every crook in town at any level would show up on that street once a week. I made piles of arrests. I just had a whole lot of fun. You would look after the drunks. You would arrest them for their own protection, put them in and let them sober up, and then they would leave again. Although we had drunk court at one time, and I always remember the story about the vagrancy court. We had a Polish guy on one of the other shifts, and he was notorious for arresting these guys for vagrancy, just no money or anything. So Judge Bewley, as a matter of fact, one morning he said, I was sitting in court watching this, and he says, "Mr. Jones," or whatever he says, "do you understand what you're under arrest for?" And he says, "No, sir, I don't." He said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And he says, "Well," he says, "Officer Paulus Chuck walked up and he says, 'You're under arrest for WAG A.' He said, 'I don't know what WAG A is.'" Of course, it's the Polish accent for vagrancy. Well, Bewley threw it right out right then and there. I was in court morning and afternoon. I'd have 4 or 5 cases in the morning. We'd arrest people rolling drunks. We'd arrest thieves, arrested hookers, under the vagrancy section again, and drunk rollers were the primary story. So I would be in court for 5 days a week, morning and afternoon. And anybody here doesn't know who Harry Rankin was? He was the famous Vancouver lawyer who was basically the BC Civil Liberties Union before it was invented. He was just a terror. So I'm sitting there one morning, I've got a case, and there was a vagrancy section for a woman and a hooker. And in those days you had to do various things, and of course the interview on the street afterwards was one of the things. So I started in on this story about how I'd asked her what she said and what she'd been doing and on, and about halfway through I thought, that's not right. And I realized that was the case. The next one. I was given the conversation on that. Oh, God. So I told the judge, I said, "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I made a mistake. I've got another couple of cases this morning, and this is the conversation from the next case." I said, "Mr. Haney here, that's not what you said." Well, of course, Harry saw his opportunity. He jumped up. He had hobnail boots on, I think, and he was going to stomp me. And he went up one side of me and down the other, and finally, a little wee judge, just a milquetoast of a guy, sat up and said, "Mr. Rankin," he said, "I won't have a police officer badgering my court like this. Sit down." Now then, officer, carry on with a proper conversation. Harry was just sitting there fuming. And Harry said to me afterwards, he said, "You handled that pretty well." And I knew Harry later in life, and he was a great guy. He was as conservative as anybody, although he was an NDP or Communist Party, whatever you want to call it. But he knew where the bodies were all buried. And he was a great guy to talk to. He'd retired, and so had I. And we'd have lunch together quite often. And the stories he told were just fascinating. A great guy. The Skid Road area was just a sewer now, but it was kind of a neat place. There was the people that lived down there, the old loggers and that had fallen on hard times, their pensions weren't very big, and they'd live in these single room hotels. Often the beer parlor was their recreation hall, and they'd sit there and they'd make 2 beer last all day, a lot of them. But the others out on the street, there was a real, I don't know if community is the right word, but there was I guess it is probably, society, I guess would be a better word. And there was drug addicts, and there was hookers, and there was drunk rollers, and there was drug traffickers, and on and on and on. But everybody had their place, and it got along quite well. Anybody who got out of line, I arrested them. And we all got along fine. I treated them all with the respect they expected to get and deserved. Until one night, afternoon, I guess 10 o'clock or something, I see a couple of guys down there, and they'd had a few beer, and they're raising a little hell, and I think those are the people that caused the trouble. So I looked at this guy, and I thought, So I walked up to him, and I said, and I won't use his name, but he was from Royal Oak, and I said, "If you don't get your ass out of this area pretty quick," I said, "I'm going to kick it, and then I'm going to put you in jail. Now get the blankety blank out of here." And he looked at me, and of course I called him by name, and he had no idea. He was off like a shot. My brother was sitting in the beer parlor 10 days later, listening to him tell the story about this great Jesus big cop that had come up to him down in Vancouver and offered to kick his rear end and put him in jail. He said, "I left pretty quick." One of the local guys. So he was about the only one I think I ever ran from here. It was interesting down there. I remember another summer night, there was a bar fight on the corner of Columbia and Hastings, and I went in and I grabbed this big logger, and I had him in a headlock, and he wanted to kill me. That was it. So my partner called for the wagon. Well, I'm still standing there, guy, beautiful summer night, and people are looking at me, and I'm looking at them and hanging on to this guy, and there was a black guy, older gentleman, sitting on the stairs of the pub I'd just come out of, and he's wearing a full overcoat. Now that's kind of odd. And there was a young fella standing, early 20s, I guess, and he's talking to this guy, and it looked like a pretty civil conversation, and the guy's standing with one foot on the stair, and he's sort of leaning over at him like this. And I'll never forget it. It was in slow motion. The black guy reached into his overcoat, and out comes a butcher knife and stuck this kid, just like that. Actually cut the pericardium, which is the thin membrane that holds the heart. He was that close to getting the heart itself. Now what do I do? I'm not letting go of this guy because he's going to kill me. And as long as the black guy saw, I got my partner who was head in the clouds or something. I said, "Use your ambulance, call some help," and we got this guy in the wagon. Charged the old guy with attempted murder, and I talked to the kid in the hospital that night, and thought he should maybe buy a lottery ticket. And of course we got to court, and the black guy said they called him the N-word, and he didn't think that was right, so he took his knife out and stabbed him, and of course the judge let him go. Don't know whatever happened to him. So eventually I got out of the skid, didn't want to get out, but I did. I moved up to Granville Street. Actually, it was, before I left, it was down on Cordova Street, there was actually it was 4 hotels. There was Hilton across the street. There was the Travelers, the New Fountain, and the Stanley, the New Fountain, and the Travelers. And I hear somebody saying, "Well, you've been in them, Jack?"
St. Helens?
Eh?
St. Helens?
Oh, that's on Granville Street. And you walk through them, and of course you're the guy in costume, so get a little bit of sniping at you, and you put up with it. It was mostly good nature. And one night, I was in one of them, and it was just getting too much. The guy was big. I didn't realize how big he was, or I would have left. And he had a whole bunch of Indian girls around him. Of course, he was showing off. So I said, "That's enough of that." Well, he said, "Get out of here before you get hurt," and I should have. I said, "Outside." So this guy stood up, and up, and up, and he was like this. So I thought I might be in a little trouble here, and as luck would have it, I'd been walking for 10 minutes with a guy off the next beat. So I got outside, and I don't know how I'm going to handle this. The guy takes his leather jacket off and throws it in the ground. And I was debating about shooting him. I mean, he was that big. And all of a sudden, my partner launches into him, knocked him down, got his head, cracked it on the sidewalk. We got the handcuffs out. Now, you've all watched television, I guess. They just put the handcuffs on. There's nothing to it. Well, I'll tell you. I wiggled, and I got one notch in my handcuffs on this guy's wrists. So I went, wow. So we took him up to jail, and we got the whole staff out, and I said, "Well, I put him on you, I'll take him off." So he rubbed his wrists, and he said, "Well," he says, "you won that one. Like, there's going to be a return bout." So for the next week, I'd walk down the middle of the street, great big tough cop, and I'd walk up to a beer car and I'd look in the window. Nah, he ain't here. In he'd go. I ran into him years later. I was in the drug squad. He was in a hotel on Granville Street as the bouncer. And I thought, "Oh, what the hell, I'll bring it up." He said, "Was that you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "God," he says, "you got me good that night." That was the end of it. That was just the way they lived. Another night, I was in the Plaza Cafe at 151 East Hastings, which was the heroin capital of Canada for users. About 4 in the morning, and again, some guy like the local yokel from here is in the place causing nothing but trouble. So I told him to leave, and he didn't. So the two of us got into a kind of a violent discussion, rolling around on the floor. And of course, there's six people in each booth, and the place is roaring. So I'm with him again, trying to get these handcuffs on him and expecting a kick in the head at any time, and nothing happened. I stood him up and I looked, and here, sitting at the end of the walkway of the alley, there's a great big black guy, Fay Harding. He was a professional boxer at one time who had, I guess his career had fallen away, and he was standing there watching. Nothing happened to me. And that was, you treated people right, you got treated right. So then I went up to Granville Street, into the West End, and I did several projects up there. We had a rooming house detail that you hustled all the apartment managers. You drive by in a car and you get to one level, but there's 15 floors above them. You don't know who's up there, what's going on, or anything else, but the manager's there. So we worked with them and found some good crooks. I remember one, the guy said, he said, "God, we're getting a lot of people up to the penthouse." And so I watched, and of course they're all addicts coming and going. So I went back to him. I said, "You check this guy's references?" "Oh yeah," he says, "we place over on Burnaby Street, just excellent references." So I got his references, and of course what he'd done is he'd given his own phone number over on Burnaby Street to say he was the manager. So when this guy on the Harold Street phoned, he was just the nicest guy he'd ever want to meet. So we got rid of him. Another one was the nightclubs on Hornby Street. They were becoming the offices, I guess, for the sort of the upscale criminal element. We'd drive by in the police car, and they would wave at us. Often they'd use all 5 fingers. Quite often they'd just use one. And that kind of irritated us, because once they were inside, they were sort of untouchable. So partner and I said, "Well, this isn't very good." So we went to the boss and explained this, and he said, "Well, go ahead." So we talked to the club managers. They wanted us around. The odd gun had been starting to show up. Bouncers loved us because of that. And the only downside now, I realize, we said, "Well, we can't just stand around there picking our nose. We've got to have a drink or a glass or something in our hand." I said, "The bar is yours, fellas." And my liver is still quivering right now thinking about that. It was a great time, but they all wanted to show us how smart they were. And she would tell us a little bit of a story, and he would tell us a little bit more of a story. And lady at the back would tell us a little bit more of a story. At the end of the night, we had the whole story. We had one guy, knew we were policemen, what he was thinking of. He told us that he was going to go do a B&E that night, told us where it was and what he expected to get out of it. Oh, that's now, well, good luck. I saw him a week later, he couldn't figure out how he got caught. I mean, we weren't dealing with brain surgeons here. Another funny story in the West End, there was a bunch of old big-time houses, and they'd been broken up into two-room suites and that sort of thing. And one morning we got a call on Butte Street, just off Robson, about 10 o'clock in the morning, and a young fella who had been playing chess with this old guy, I guess they were friends, and he was a little concerned. He couldn't raise, he came over to see his friend, and he couldn't raise him. He didn't think he was out or anything. So we found a key, found a manager, and in we go. And sure enough, the old guy is dead. Now, he had died again on the floor. Why this happens, I don't know. But he was lying there, reasonably straight, but he had one arm tucked up here above his head, so the floor is right behind me. And we called the ambulance who carried the bodies away in those days. Now, the ambulance drivers had all been around forever. They were very, very good, and they knew everything. And as luck would have it, we got one of the old guys and the kid's first day on the job. So in they come, and they put the stretcher down, and the experienced guy, of course, he takes the feet, the other guy gets the head, and there's a little bit of gas build up in there, and he's, wow. So they move him onto the stretcher. Here's his hand sticking out above the handles. And the young fellow says, "What do I do?" He says, "Bend it down over his chest." So, of course, rigor mortis had set in, and it goes snap, crackle, and pop. And he says, "You're not hurting him. Just bend it down." So this thing snaps down like this, and he gets it right over his chest. He says, "Now get the sheet." The young fellow turns around to get the sheet, and of course the rigor mortis is still in there. Turns around with the sheet, just in time to see this coming back at him. Well, I'll tell you, you've all seen the Roadrunner cartoons where there's the feet are scrambling and the dust is flying and everything else. Exactly what this guy did. Out the door he's gone, and he finally stopped when he got to Butte Street. The poor young fellow whose friend is dead, he's sitting on the porch wondering what the hell's going on. There's two policemen are absolutely helpless on the couch laughing, and the other ambulance driver is just about ready. He's looking for the bathroom. He's going to wet himself. And that, one of the things that happens. Jack Wasserman, does everybody remember him, the old saloon columnist? I became pretty good friends with him when we were doing that nightclub thing. And very powerful man, very good man. I remember being with him. We'd end up at his office at the end of the night for a drink, or we'd end up down in the living room cabaret with a whole bunch of us having a drink. And he would, at 3 in the morning, he'd pick up the phone and phone a cabinet minister. And they answered, and "Yes, Mr. Wasserman, sir," because all people would phone him with their problems. And he would solve a lot of them. I remember for Grace McCarthy, he picked up the phone one morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, Grace, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Came to work that night, had been fixed. I mean, he was just a good guy. So I'm walking down the street with him on Hornby Street one night, and in Vancouver, they always flushed and swept the streets. Now the flushers had the sprays on the front, and they would drive down, and a point of honor with them was they never got a pedestrian. You could be on the sidewalk and you wouldn't get a drip of water. Walking down the street that night, the flusher went by, and Jack and I are both soaked right up to our knees. Well, he was just beside himself. He says, "I'll look after that, don't worry about it." And he did. Years later, I'm working out in southwest Vancouver, and I was sitting with a young fellow on a stakeout at an electronics store. It's supposed to be B&E. And of course you start telling history and everything else. I said, "What did you do before you came here, Chico?" And he says, "I worked for the city." I said, "What did you do?" He said, "I drove a flusher truck." And he started to laugh. And he said, he says, "That a-hole Wasserman," he says, walking down the street one night, and he said, I thought, "To hell with this." So he said, "I got him." And the other guy, I said, "Interesting. Did you get much trouble with that?" He said, "You have no idea." And I said, "I'll tell you something, pal, your troubles aren't over yet." that was me. He got a lot of crappy jobs for a while. I worked, this is not much Royal Oak stuff, but the local boy makes good, I guess. I worked some good jobs. I worked the drug squad, ran the other undercover team for 18 months. We bought everything from heroin to fur coats. Just had a great time doing that. Somebody asked me one time at that point, I said, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm a professional liar. Of course, you taught these young fellows how to lie to these people and get the drugs, et cetera, et cetera. Then I went to, for the major crime squad. We did bank robberies, armored car robberies. We had one with a guy where they tried to execute him at Woodward's. And they were also known in Toronto, and the girlfriend had rented an apartment on Alberni Street, and we went up and nobody home, so we got the key and went in. And looking around and opened the filing cabinet, and there was his escape kit. He had a rope that would reach from about the 8th floor down to the ground. He had a gun, and I don't know what else in there, but anyway, I had the greatest urge to knock about 30 feet off that rope. But I thought, I better not do that. The only mistake, we took the gun, of course, and then we staked it out. The only mistake I made, I think I would, to this day, love to have had a TV camera looking at him, the look on his face when he opened that drawer. Because we were listening to him, and he opened the drawer, and you could just hear the pregnant pause, and the next thing, he was out the door. And of course, there was 3 guys with a shotgun standing there looking at him. He lifted up his briefcase, which had Kevlar in it, and reached for his gun. Why they didn't shoot him, I don't know. We got his partner down the street, and they were locked away for a long time. There was an escape attempt out of maximum security with a helicopter. It was supposed to be them, but a guard had been missing that morning, and they weren't in the usual spot. Nice guys. Lots of murders, kidnappings we did. The best, well, I did 2 of them in my time in there, and the best one, of course, was the day Jim Patterson's daughter got kidnapped. And of course, you don't know what you're dealing with here. So, you can get somebody killed if you make the wrong step. The bosses wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of that. They just went and hid. But they could sure second guess you afterwards. So we did the usual things. We dropped the money off at the right place, and the interesting thing is that the guy asked for the same amount of money, and unbeknownst to him, that Patterson had just got kidnap insurance for that exact same amount of money. So now he's thinking that it's his own staff or somebody that's in on this. It turned out to be a bunch of punks in North Vancouver. So he dropped the money in the basement of the Hudson Bay where they asked for it, and the kid picked it up and just took off at a dead run. All our surveillance team is burned there, so we chased him and lost him. And the lady that ran the security at the Bay phoned me, and she said, what was going on here last night? So you're sworn to secrecy, but so I told her anyway. 2 hours later, they phoned, these same yokels had arrived back in a limousine, the whole gang spending the money. The night before, once we dropped the money, of course, they released her. And what a nice lady she was, young lady. She was still wearing her dressing gown, and they duct taped her eyes closed. And of course, when they released her, she got that off and got into a house. And I arrived there with her husband minutes later, and I looked at her and said, nice hat. Now, this woman had been tied up and everything all day, and yeah, you're Patterson's daughter. She said, you like it? That was it. I mean, what a tough woman she was. Had a bunch of extortions, of course. The best one was Joe Siegel, very, very rich individual in Vancouver, Jewish guy. Very, very rich. And of course, he got the note and thought, what do I do? So he phoned Joe Cohen, who owned Sony, who had the connections, who phoned the chief, who phoned down, and finally ended up with me at about 8 o'clock at night, and I thought, this is not going to be good when all that heat's on it. So a couple of days later, we were interviewing him, and he'd asked, I forget what he'd asked for, it wasn't a whole lot of money, and Joe's wife very nicely said, I don't know why he didn't just write us a letter. She says, we probably would have written him a check. And he said, what? She said, we get letters all the time, she said, and, I need $1,000 to finish my degree, or my baby needs milk, or all these stories. She said, we just send them a check. That's the way it was. So we got this guy, and I was sitting in Joe's waiting room out in his office in downtown Vancouver with my partner afterwards, and on the table is a coffee table book on the Hudson Bay. And my partner's looking at the book, and Joe comes out, oh, guys, come on in. And Dave put the book down. He said, I just about bought that. I said, yeah, I know. So we leave, and Dave said to me afterwards, he says, what a cheap bugger he is. He says, what, do you steal the book or what? I said, no, Dave, the company, the Hudson Bay. He had a controlling interest in Hudson Bay and the kind of money he had. Just astounding. And then there was the fun one. The kid phoned me that I knew, and he said, I've got a guy who wants somebody killed. I said, okay. So we got an undercover RCMP member, and we got this kid to introduce him that he would do the killing. And what had happened is this guy was a stock promoter type, and he had a girlfriend who worked in one of the trust companies that actually print the stock certificates. So she printed up a whole bunch of, I think it was Trans-Canada Pipeline, or one of those top companies anyway. They had a stack like this. So now how do you sell them? Well, this guy was pretty sharp. He was going to send them to the Grand Cayman Islands and use them as security for a big loan. It would have worked like a charm, but how do you get to the Caymans? So a little Irishman, just like a little garden gnome, comes in and he bounces, oh, I can do that. He says, so da-da-da-da-da, and they look at each other, and so he gives them the stock, and the guy says, this will be easy. So he goes back to Toronto and he gets a young stockbroker to sell them. Well, that's what they call a certificate of encumbrance. He couldn't prove where they come from, and of course when they started looking at them, they realized they're phony stock, so it works back, and they all get arrested. So this guy is so upset he wants to kill the little Irishman. So back we charged them with counseling murder. They were all charged, of course, with stock fraud. They all beat that. And the guy did 5 years for wanting somebody killed. Just a poetic justice, I guess. In those days we would walk. We had 3 shifts, and two of us would walk the beats in the skids. And then they decided that we shouldn't. They needed us somewhere else, so they pulled us off the beats, and of course they just went to hell. So now they just suddenly decide, well, they erred their ways, but now they need a whole team to clean that up. And of course Bernie Smith was just the classic man to do that. But they had about 8 guys doing what 2 of us used to do. But he got lots of TV out of it, and he was a good guy. He was lots of fun, lots of good jokes. So he started swinging at this guy, and a small 1-bedroom apartment. You go in the door, could turn right into the kitchen, or if you went past that, you'd go in the bedroom, but the living room out here, and he started chasing this guy around and around the sink area of the kitchen. And on the way by, there was a dish rack. He picked up this nice filleting knife, just happened to be in the dish rack, and got this guy, I guess. The guy bonked him with his club a couple of times, and he stabbed him again and kept running. And of course, he hit the good artery. And the faster this guy ran, the faster his heart ran, the faster the blood was leaving his body, or out of his system. And he was like the opposite of the Energizer Bunny. Stopped and died, of course. He pumped it out. And the little guy had got away, got outside, and when we showed up, he came to us. He bonked on the head with us pretty good. Later, when I retired, 3 of us started a stable, and we've been very, very lucky. We would claim a horse for $20,000 to $25,000. We had the first one made $60,000 in 6 weeks for us. Somebody claimed him. Claimed a mare for 20. We made 250 with her. Sold her as a brood mare for 20. A couple others. We claimed one. We never got a start out of him. He had bad legs, so that was 25 out the window. And then we got this guy that I picked out of the crowd. claimed him for 25 as a 4-year-old. We retired him when he was 11. He ran in Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, Golden Gate in San Francisco, and Phoenix. He made us about $450,000. And the best part of him was that we would hear at San Francisco, for example, the trainer would phone us at 10 o'clock in the morning and say, I've entered him for 2 days from now. By noon, my partner and I are across the border and gone. Just time after time after time. It was just a great time. He won the biggest race in Vancouver for older horses worth $100,000. We got $60,000 of that, and he was just a neat professional racehorse. We've had a good time. I retired. I couldn't stop and went into started my own PI, private investigation business. Mostly asset searches for guys hiding money from their husband, or the other way around, husbands from the wives. Some of them are just so stupid you wouldn't believe it. But one guy ran up he was working offshore, and he made all his profit and kept it offshore. He ran up all his bills here. I found $1 million in the bank in China of his and $1 million in New York. Now to prove it, you had to bring the people to court, so we couldn't afford to do that. So I went and deposited $50 in each account in his name, and it was accepted. So that's not proof, but the judge heard it. She said, okay. He got stung pretty good. The funniest one, of course, was a guy was, I don't know what he's doing on the internet or where he was, but he found a woman in a dungeon. And of course it's all show and make-believe, and, dark, dirty dungeon, and she's in a cave. So he was in London, England. He wrote a letter to I guess he did a lot of research, strictly research, and found out it was made in Vancouver. So he wrote a letter to the chief constable that this is absolutely disgusting, that this would go on in his fair city. So the vice squad weren't very bright in that case. They got on their white horses, they ran out to the place, and they seized everything in the place, all his computers, absolutely everything. But the problem was they couldn't prove what had been shown. So they were going to, he would have beat the charges hands down. He says, no, I want to know what the contemporary community standards, or what the case was, what the criteria was. So he wanted to know. So his lawyer phoned me and brought me in and told me the story, and he said, actually there was a show called Kink at the time. I'm sure nobody here watched it. Somebody did. He says, I want you to go to these parties and see what's going on, how acceptable it is and everything else. And I thought, oh, okay. So there was one night, and it's all fetish stuff, and I didn't know what the hell to wear. So I'm like, well, won't talk about my fetishes. But so anyway, I went to the costume shop, and I said, the kid was kind of embarrassed, and I said, yeah, I'm going to this party. And he says, you're going to the party? He says, God, I got just the thing for you. So I walk out of there. I'm dressed like, I guess, one of Robin Hood's archers. I got the hat on, I got the pheasant feathers sticking out of here, and I'm thinking, God, am I stupid. So my wife just killed herself laughing. Anyway, I went out the door and I walked into this place, and man, it was different. There was a dungeon in the basement, people getting flogged and all kinds of things. Dance floor upstairs, there wasn't a lot of clothing on there, and then a bar upstairs. And the funny thing was, I was kicking myself for doing it, is what I was doing. And after about 15 minutes, I thought, this is normal. I mean, not to you and I it's normal, but it was perfectly normal to them. And I went to several, I got rid of that costume pretty quick. Threw on a doctor's smock, and everybody said gynecologist. I said no, dermatologist. It sounded better. Actually, I came over to Victoria and did one here. The strangest thing, and there's some weird things. I mean, some of these are far out even for these people. And there was a couple of girls there, and she wanted an extension cord, and she had a commercial stapler for wallpaper, and she sat her girlfriend down and goes, plunk, this bloody big stapler in her arm. People are, even they're kind of looking at this thing, plunk, it doesn't in here and it doesn't over here. But I'll show you the mentality. I was here in Victoria, and one woman thought she'd found a new play toy, I think, so I was talking to her about what was, gathering information, what was going on here. And I said, the strangest thing I've seen from the outsider looking in was this thing with the staples. And she stopped for a minute, and she said, well, they're going so fast it wouldn't hurt. Oh, boy. Bizarre. Just bizarre. But that was the furthest out. We went to court. We had some fun with a prosecutor who was an Irish Catholic, and he thought it was sinful, I think. A couple of pictures here. There's one much younger. We seized a whole bunch of guns from a gangster. Pass that around. He wasn't happy with us. Now you see lineups on television. I've got another lineup here. We had a group of guys in Vancouver, Levinson brothers, Dwight Erickson, and 3 or 4 of them, and they were world-class jewel thieves. And of course I'd sort of grown up. They started when I started, and we'd sort of grown up together. I was on Seymour Street having lunch with a friend one day in uniform. I was supposed to be away at southwest Vancouver. And I saw Dwight pull up in his Jag in this stop there, loading zone, and he's out of the car, and I said to my partners, oh God, I said, here, pay the bill. I've got to go to work. So I stood on the door and waited. He's got to come back to his car. So sure enough, he'd come bopping back in about 5 minutes, well-dressed, sport jacket, the whole thing. I said, Dwight, come here. Oh, God. And here in his pocket was about 6 watches, and they were all top end Tag Heuer and on and on. Still had the price tags on them. We were parked right outside a jewelry store, and it had bay windows on it. So he'd gone up to the corner of in the corner door, walked down the length of the place, in behind the counter, up to the front window, bay window where these things were stuck. Put them in his pocket, walked back out, and the people in the store, oh, please, what are they doing? Of course, they still had the price. They didn't know they were gone. Nobody saw them. They were good. They were very, very good. They had a hands. I remember sitting in one of the clubs one night. We had a couple of dollars in change on the table, and this guy was so drunk he couldn't talk, and I saw the flower girl coming, so I picked up my bills, and he reached down and he picked that off the counter like that. I can't pick it up like that. He had the whole works in his hand. They were just brilliant. So I said, this is not your day, and he said, no, and it's going to get worse. There was another place out in the Arbutus Gardens, jewelry store, bay windows, black velvet cloth, loose diamonds, all various sizes in here. So on the weekend, these guys had gone and picked the putty or whatever it was out from between the windows, and they had a stick with gum on the end, a chewing gum on the end. And the guy put them out on Monday morning, and these guys sort of hung around the store, and they reached in and went, one was too big to get out. Instead of trying to pry the window, they just left it. We'll get more. And of course, poor old Dwight had these stones in an envelope. He just had them appraised from a jeweler that they dealt with. But what he didn't know is those diamonds had all been spectrographed, and that's where they shine a light through them, and they come up with various rainbow colors or whatever they do. They could all be identified, and of course these could all be identified. That's the lineup that I put him in. He's number 13. I don't know, it wasn't his lucky number. This guy, number 4, he was a serial bank robber that we got. I think we caught him for about 10 banks. The funny thing is, too, when we did lineups, we would, usually about 6 o'clock at night we'd do them because the people were working and they would come down for, and we had the people, find people that fit the bad guy description, height and age and maybe a mustache or a beard. So we'd walk through the beer parlors, the local beer parlors, And of course, 6 o'clock, these guys look at us and they said, I'll go. I said, no mustache. We don't, no mustaches. I'll go home and shave. We gave them $20 to appear in a lineup. They were just as happy as clams to appear for us. And once they realized that they got picked out, we knew it was the wrong guy. That was good. Just one other picture I was going to show you anyway. You probably wouldn't want to look at it. It's an autopsy. The only interesting thing about it was the guy had been machine gunned, and his partner was in the other operating room. And this surgeon was by himself, and I was in looking for bullets out of the body, and he had gloves on me, and I was holding this and plugging that hole and everything else. And he was the only one that ever came down to check and see his diagnosis was right the next morning. So, not a lot of Royal Oak fun, but
Do you ever get used to it?
oh yeah,
You do.
yeah. No, it's just part of the job.
Good job.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
Well, it's been wonderful hearing about it.
Well,
I'm glad you were doing it.
not a lot of Royal Oak, but I've had a lot of fun.